we'll just be talking about these circulating hormones today. All right, so next we want to talk about the functions of the endocrine system, right? And it's a big, big function. It's doing a whole bunch of stuff right here. They're, big part of homeostasis is having the proper levels of endocrine hormones, the hormones doing their proper job, right? And when it says regulating the activity, right, there's a whole bunch of stuff that falls under that category. Your whole metabolism, your energy balance, all your, what we talked about, the balance of your interstitial fluid, right? And the electrolyte concentration, right? All that's being controlled or affected, right? Maintain homeostasis by your hormone activity. Right, the contraction of smooth and cardiac muscle fibers, as well as glandular secretions. It's going to share this function with the autonomic nervous system, right, the actual wiring. And then it also has some immune activity, right? So big range, right? All that stuff that's normal for the cell to occur, right, is largely dependent on the hormones, right? Because the hormones are going to respond to other stimuli that's going to tell these cells to work harder or work less or something, right? And then a little bit more, in a little bit more specific instances, your testosterone, your estrogen, right? It's going to be a huge factor during adolescence, right? The whole muscle and bone growth during that is due to these sex hormones, right? It's going to be involved in all the cycles of the reproductive systems. And then there's also that circadian rhythms, right? Your sleep-wake cycle by melatonin. Probably people here have heard of melatonin. That's another hormone that affects your sleep-wake cycles, right? So big, huge effects everywhere we look with the endocrine system, right? As far as the functions of it. All right. So next we're going to talk about, we released the endocrine cells into the blood, right? And now it's circulating around. It has access to everywhere in the body, right? And there's going to be two different types of endocrine we'll talk about here, but I first want to talk about how it finds its particular target, right? Why, despite the fact that it's circulating all around the blood, how is it going to find its specific target cell, right? Because it can go anywhere. How does it know, right? How does your insulin know which cells to get to? How does it know, right, to get to the liver or muscle cells or something like that, right? So that has to do with these receptors over here, right? The receptors, specificity. So when we talk about receptors and the specificity, we remember that proteins, right, had a very particular shape, right? And they had to be maintained. That shape had to be maintained by proper pH, proper temperature and everything, because that specific shape determined who it interacted with, how it interacted with them, right? In the case of enzymes, but also in the case of these receptors, right? Because the cell, these proteins right here, these transmembrane proteins shown here in blue, pink, and green, they all had a very specific binding site. In this case, it had a square binding site. This one has a triangle. This one has a whatever, right? And so that when this chemical messenger is floating around all these cells, this is the only one that's going to hear it, right? It's like this is a messenger, a radio signal being passed out. This is the only one that's tuned to it. Right? This is the mechanism in which it does that. It hears, only this cell hears that, right? These cells are totally deaf to this, right? So if this is adrenaline trying to pump the activity of the cell, these cells don't care at all, right? They don't hear it. So the square one's going in there, right? Binding to very specific receptor. All right, so everybody get the idea. You have hormones circulating your blood. It'll go everywhere maybe, but it's only going to be, only the target cells can respond to it, right? Or let's just say they can respond to it or something that looks very much like it. In the case of like mimicry and agonists and stuff like that. So here is, the bloodstream, blood is flowing through here. You got hormone 1, you got hormone 2 floating in here. They might both be released in the same area, right? Hormone 2 has zero effect on hormone on this cell right here, this target cell, because it only has receptors for hormone 1. And so that's the general idea of target specificity, why it can be so specific. Right, so that's a major point in how this works, how the whole system works. Okay, so the hormone is floating around, it finds its target receptor, and maybe it finds a bunch of receptors on a cell, right? The more receptors it could bind, the stronger the effect is going to be, right? So cells themselves can influence their own response to it by increasing or decreasing their number of receptors, right? So the more receptors, the more sensitive the target cell is to that hormone. The less receptors, the less sensitive it is, right? So there's all sorts of examples of this where, maybe the hormone itself, after a while, one of the effects, the downstream effects of binding is to start decreasing the number of receptors, right? That would be kind of a negative feedback cycle on that, right? Of homeostatic regulation. So the target cells themselves can increase or decrease the number of receptors, right? That's upregulation and downregulation and upregulation, right? So when we talk about the responsiveness, right, the levels of hormone in the blood is going to be one thing, and the abundance of the target cell's hormone receptors, which the cell itself can do. Maybe other hormones are going to influence that, right? But that is one way that the responsiveness is affected there or influenced by. All right. And so, as I said, maybe that upregulation and downregulation was caused by another hormone, right? So we want to talk about the responsiveness of a cell. We want to look about a little bit the terminology surrounding these influence exerted by these other hormones, right? These hormone interactions, right? So these different target cells, they have various receptors, right? They can bind multiple hormones, although they, will only bind the hormones that they have receptors for. They can bind a whole bunch of them, right? They can have receptors for a whole bunch of hormones, right? And that can cause a very unique effect, right? So sometimes a hormone like hormone A needs hormone B to allow it to respond, right? The effects of some hormones and target just require a second hormone, and maybe that's to make an enzyme that's necessary for its receptor to bind. Maybe it's a synergistic. Maybe it's just maybe it changes the conformation of the receptor. But for whatever reason, you need this second hormone, right? And that second hormone is said to have this permissive effect, right? You need that second hormone for it to bind, right? A second type is a synergistic effect, right? When you have two hormones acting together, right? The effect is not 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 = 10 or 1,000 or something like that, right? A synergistic effect, right? When two of these are working together. And then there's antagonistic effects, right? And you could also compose it with agonistic effects, right? One hormone, you have two hormones that bind, one kind of cancels out the other one. Right? So all that's going to influence the responsiveness of the cell, any of these complex interactions that might happen right here. And I don't know if we ever go into any particular details that this might happen, but that's just the general language we might see about the effect that a hormone might have on any particular cell. Well, here's an example. Your thyroid, which we'll talk a little bit about next time, right? When it binds to a cell, the effect is to increase the number of a certain type of other receptors on here, right? And so it does that a little bit, right, by itself. But epinephrine also will do that a little bit by itself, when you combine them together, right, you don't just get an additive effect, right? You get this sort of synergistic effect where you vastly increase the production of this, right? When you combine these together, then you get this synergistic effect. And so this is good because some cells only want maybe a little bit, other cells want a little bit of this. So the combination of this effectively makes like a new kind of hormone receptor interaction, right? It's a kind of unique one that this cell doesn't have, this cell doesn't have, but this cell has because it has both receptors. That's a synergistic effect. And then as far as antagonistic one, you could think of this in terms of drugs, and this goes for neurotransmitters too, but they can make hormones, or certain drugs are able to block the receptor, the binding site to the hormones, and act as an antagonist, right? Other ones fit into it very nicely and increase the activity, right? So there's also agonist drugs, right? So a lot of drugs are going to work that way, right? They're going to they're going to affect a normal pathway and increase the effect there. All right, so that is the responsiveness of the cell, right? Once that hormone has gone through the blood, it is going to bind to those receptors and have its particular effect, right? The cell is going to be responsiveness based on some of those things.
And so next time we'll talk about the two broad categories of hormones and their particular mechanism of action in the cell. See you next time.